This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 620, entitled An Open Masculist Letter to the Politicians. Society Needs Masculism to Survive. Description. This flyer is an open letter to the politicians, lobbying them to push for the creation of a biconscious society, a FIP Society, so that young men stop refusing to date young women at a rate of 60%. Monoconscious feminism has made young women so obnoxious to American young men under 30 that 60% of these men not only refuse to marry and reject paternity due to the toxicity of the divorce courts taken over by the fluffie feminists, but they don't even date young women, thus causing a catastrophic crash in the birth rate. So the politicians need to make this issue centre stage in their consciousness, to learn some masculism, to become biconscious, to set up GECs, GECs, gender equality committees in the parliaments, and to menfair the gender laws by passing the paternity rejection right, the OBTAB, OBTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth, etc., so that young men are prepared to be fathers again. Otherwise, we wipe ourselves out in about 4 generations, if one does the math. Now the flyer itself. An open masculist letter to the politicians. Society Needs Masculism to Survive, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. The subtitle of this flyer, Society Needs Masculism to Survive, is not a metaphorical fiction, but is to be taken literally. Recently, a statistic came out in the US that young men under 30 are not only rejecting marriage and paternity at a rate of 70% and growing, but now 60% of these young men reject even dating women. I believe that this statistic is the greatest of all existential threats, because the odds of humanity wiping itself out via mass paternal rejection are a lot higher than the odds of other existential threats such as global warming, nuclear holocaust, etc. So should be centre stage for the politicians. So this flyer is aimed at them in the form of an open letter, aiming to make politicians conscious of the enormous implications of 60% of young men refusing to even date women. To make the point, here is a little math. Let's assume that young men continue to refuse to date young women because these men feel that monoconscious feminism, more on this later, has made young women so obnoxious as to be undateable. Let's say that in a few years that fraction will be 2/3. So the young generation reproduces at most about 1/3 of their number, and that this situation continues for several generations. What happens to society? It gets wiped out. Why? Broadly speaking, with rough numbers, if the total population keeps reducing by 2/3 each generation, how many generations are needed to effectively wipe out the whole population? About 4. Why? Because 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3 is 1/81. That is roughly 1%. That is, the other 99% have died off or were never born. The population has effectively annihilated itself. Some countries are rich democratic migrant countries, like the US, Canada, Australia, etc., so have the luxury to be less concerned about a mass population crash than poorer, less democratic countries. Hungary, for example, is now so concerned with its population crash that it spends 5% of its GNP on birth promotion, that is, tax breaks for couples with more than 2 kids, hefty maternity grants, etc. Similarly for Russia and many other countries. But despite America's immigration program, the fraction of 60% of young men not even dating women is terrifying, since it will mean that America too will wipe itself out in a mere few generations. Again, do the math. America allows in approximately 2/3 migrants per year. So over a generation, say 25 years, that's a total of about 8 million, which is a mere fraction of 1/40 compared to its population of roughly 320 million. So migration increases the US population by a mere 2% or so. But this fraction is negligible compared to the 2/3 die-off per generation caused by young men, 60% of them refusing to even date women, who find modern young women undateable due to these women's monoconscious feminist bitchery. Politicians need to take these statistics to heart, become alarmed, and then do some solid thinking about how to stop America and similar countries from wiping itself out. Masculists need to do some serious and hefty rattling of politicians' cages so that these politicians step up to the plate and make some important decisions. The first step these politicians need to make is to get informed about the problem via congressional hearings in which prominent masculists present to them the case that modern monoconscious feminism has made young women so obnoxious, so detestably monoconscious, that young men utterly reject them, especially now that millions of young men are now absorbing masculist and MGTOW ideas. So do not tolerate misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi bitches and leave them to rot on the shelf. These prominent masculists in these congressional hearings need to educate the politicians about the main ideas of masculism and how women so massively oppress men with women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, etc. Masculists then need to persuade these politicians that their strategy ought to be to promote the spread of masculism as a means to save society from wiping itself out. There is a chain of logic behind this statement that the masculists in their hearings need to spell out to these politicians. These masculists need to tell the politicians that gender oppression is not a one-way street, despite what the monoconscious feminists claim, in brackets. Someone is monoconscious if they have only had their feminist consciousness raised, close brackets. Typically, monoconscious feminists tend to be rather feminazi bitchy because they are angry at men, because the only gender politics that feminists have been taught is feminism, which from the masculinist perspective is a deeply misandrist, gynocentric ideology that preaches to women and to society that gender oppression is a one-way street. These masculists at the congressional hearings then should teach the politicians how women oppress men worse with women's horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes mentioned above, that is, manslavery, divorce rape, forced fathering, etc. Once the politicians have had their masculinist consciousness raised, which will make them biconscious by definition, the masculists can then suggest to them that the next step that the politicians must take is the menfairing of the gender laws and the masculisting of women, so that monoconscious feminists who believe that men are pigs, men are rapists, men are toxic, which is what misandrist monoconscious feminism teaches women, are converted into being biconscious and hence will lose their monoconscious anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, in brackets, for example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, etc. By learning of female masculinist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men, and in fact worse, since to masculists, even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, is seen as small beer compared to women's horrible gender crimes against men, for example, the big three mentioned above. The masculists should aim to persuade the politicians that the biconsciousing of monoconscious feminists and society will go a long way to solving the mass population crash, since millions of men would like to have good relationships with women who are, as the masculists put it, snurfs. That's S-N-U-R-F-S. That is slim, nutritive FIPs. In brackets, FIP, F-I-P, equals financially independent persons, who would like to be fathers, but the fluffy feminists, in all their unconscious, unquestioning fluffy feminism, see men as, quote, cash machines put on this earth to pay for women to have babies, end quote. So have made the divorce courts toxic for men, causing one father in 4 to be butchered. In many countries today, the fluffy feminist controlled divorce court system is so toxic for men that now 70% of young men refuse to marry and reject paternity. The Masculists should then persuade the politicians to move on to the second major phase of Masculism after the first phase, that is, Masculist and MGTOW consciousness raising, that is, becoming aware of Masculist and MGTOW ideas. That second major phase is politics, which is the job of the politicians, whom these Masculists are lobbying. The Masculists should tell these politicians that GECs, GECs, Gender Equality Committees, should be set up in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male Masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally. If the monoconscious feminist politicians in these hearings object to this, then the Masculists can accuse them of being mass genociders, since already 60% of young men refuse to even date women, so obviously something is very wrong with women. The Masculists can then appeal to the male politicians, telling them how horrible are the gender crimes against men committed by women and the monoconscious feminists. The Masculists should then recommend to the politicians that the Masculist half of these GECs should push for the legislation of the PARA, that's paternity rejection right, so that women become unable to commit one of the worst of gender crimes, and that is forced fathering, where a man is forced by a woman to pay for decades for a kid he never wanted in the first place. The Masculists should explain to the politicians that the fact that women have the MARA, maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, that is, that women have the right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men don't have the PARA, paternity rejection right, is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists. The Masculists should also recommend to the politicians that the OBTAB, OBTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, should be legislated to block paternity fraud, which takes place in about 10% of pregnancies. The Masculists should impress upon the politicians the level of callousness and gender criminality of a woman who commits paternity fraud on a man, forcing him to pay for 2 decades for a kid that is not even his. And that such a woman should be put behind bars for 15 years for such a horrible crime, which is more serious than rape and gets a man typically a 10-year jail sentence. In jail, she shall be forced to work to pay for the cost of her incarceration and for the costs of the kid who goes with her because it is not his. The Masculists should push the politicians to promote the creation of a FIP Society, which is one in which both sexes, especially girls, are socialised and educated to be FIPs, so that they do not become fluffies as adults and then manslave and divorce rape a man, making her hated by the Masculists. The Masculists should push the politicians to help create a fully biconscious society, so that nearly all monoconscious feminists today are converted into biconsciousness. Since the longer feminists remain monoconscious, the longer young men will reject them, finding them socially and sexually repulsive. So punish them by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them. Masculist theorists are really waking up that the Masculist movement needs to move on past the Masculist consciousness raising stage and move into the major second stage of politics, that is, doing for men what the feminists did for women in the 70s, when feminists got gender laws changed that favoured women. For example, equal pay for equal work, equal entry to the professions, the abortion right, fault-free divorce, women's rights committees set up in the parliaments, etc. The time is now ripe for Masculists to do something similar, since men now have their own gender political ideology, so are capable of not only hitting back at the horrible misandry of monoconscious feminists, but to crush them with very angry, hateful Masculist harangues that terrify such women. The politicians need to be taught that the sooner they help create a biconscious society, a FIP society, then and menfair the gender laws, then the mass population crash can be lessened and even reversed. But there is a long way to go, since monoconscious feminism is deeply ingrained in society after a 6-decade monopoly of feminism over gender politics. So millions of feminists will need to have their masculist consciousnesses raised, or they will lose their boyfriends, as their boyfriends are taught by masculists about masculist ideas, who then become biconscious and find the monoconsciousness of their girlfriends repulsive and then dump them. Politicians have a major role to play in the rise of masculism, the menfairing of the gender laws, and significantly slowing down the crash of the birth rate. The politicians need to be made painfully conscious that the root cause of the birth rate crash is the monoconsciousness of the feminists, which has made these women so toxic to young men that young men find them undateable, so of course do not want to have babies with them, and hence the birth rate crash. This has to be stopped, and it is the role of the politicians to do that by biconsciousing society. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 620 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.